The last thing Officer Marcus Rowe expected on a Tuesday afternoon was to have his career ended by a woman eating a sandwich. She was sitting alone on a weathered bench at Caldwell Riverside Park, wearing faded blue scrubs, a stethoscope looped around her neck, a paper bag from a deli on her lap. Tired eyes. Sensible shoes. Everything about her said nobody. He approached her like she was an inconvenience. He spoke to her like she was less. He had no idea she was the reason 12 federal agents were hiding in the trees behind him, that the woman he was about to humiliate had spent 11 months building a case that would bring down the most dangerous criminal network in the Pacific Northwest, and that the moment he grabbed her arm, he didn't just make a mistake. He lit the fuse on his own destruction. And if you've ever been underestimated, passed over, dismissed, talked down to by someone who thought their authority made them untouchable, stay with me until the end of this story. Subscribe if you haven't already, give it a like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The bench had a broken slat on the left side, and Nurse Mara Voss had memorized exactly where to sit so it didn't dig into her lower back. That was the kind of detail you noticed when you'd been working the same park for 6 days in a row, every afternoon, pretending to be too tired to move. She'd timed her breaks to match the rhythm of the surrounding foot traffic. She knew which vendor near the east entrance closed early on Tuesdays. She knew the maintenance worker who swept the path by the water fountain always took a cigarette break at 3:40. She knew things about this park that the people who actually used it probably never noticed. She had to. Because underneath the worn scrubs and the half-eaten turkey sandwich, Mara Voss was not a nurse. She was a special agent with the FBI's Organized Crime Division, and she had 11 months of her life buried in the woman she was pretending to be. The city was Delport, a mid-sized Pacific Northwest hub that had spent the last decade trying to rebrand itself as a tech corridor while quietly hemorrhaging money through every informal channel imaginable. To tourists and newcomers, it looked like ambition. To the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, it looked like a laundering operation dressed in glass and steel. The Vortex Collective, that was what the Bureau called them internally, had routed somewhere between $60 and $90 million through Delport's restaurant chains, construction fronts, and freight logistics companies over the past 4 years. Nobody had been able to prove it. 3 previous investigations had collapsed, 2 informants had recanted, and 1 task force had been quietly disbanded after someone inside leaked the wrong name to the wrong person. Mara had been brought in because she was outside all of that history. No connection to the Delport field office, no existing relationships with local law enforcement. She'd spent a year at Millhaven Regional Hospital in a genuine nursing capacity, not undercover, actually working, because her handler, Deputy Assistant Director Nolan Price, believed the cover only worked if it was real. She'd taken the licensing exam. She'd pulled actual shifts. She'd learned how to start an IV without flinching, how to talk a frightened patient down from a panic, how to move through a medical environment like she belonged there, because she did. For 12 months, she genuinely did. The cover wasn't just a costume. That was the thing people got wrong about deep undercover work. You didn't wear a character like a jacket. You became someone else until you forgot what the seams felt like. Now it was year 2, and the operation had entered its final phase. 3 days ago, an informant inside the Vortex Collective's mid-tier logistics arm had made contact through a dead drop behind the ferry terminal. The message was brief. A courier would make a drop at Caldwell Riverside Park at 4:15 p.m. on Tuesday. The drop contained a physical storage device, old school, deliberate, untraceable, carrying the financial routing documentation the Bureau needed to connect the collective's shell accounts to its leadership. Mara's job was to identify the courier without spooking them, signal the surveillance team, and allow the exchange to complete before the arrest sweep began. Simple, controlled, the culmination of everything she'd spent 2 years building. She bit into her sandwich and watched a man in a gray jacket pause near the fountain, check his phone, and move on. Not him. Her earpiece, disguised as a foam hearing aid, the kind elderly patients often wore, carried a quiet, steady signal. 12 people in range, 4 in vehicles on adjacent streets, 2 on foot in plain clothes, 1 in a maintenance uniform, presently pretending to trim a hedge 40 meters to her left. Status? She said softly, barely moving her lips. She'd gotten very good at that. All positions nominal. The voice belonged to Agent Darcy Kimura, coordinating from a surveillance van parked on Whitmore Avenue. No visual on the courier yet. You're at T-minus 22 minutes. Mara nodded, a small motion that could have been anything. She folded the wax paper from her sandwich, set it neatly in the paper bag, and watched the park. That was when she heard footsteps on the path behind her. Deliberate, unhurried, the particular cadence of someone who expected people to get out of their way. She didn't turn around. She let the footsteps come to her, and when they stopped 6 feet to her right, she glanced up with the expression she'd practiced in hotel bathroom mirrors for months. Vaguely tired, mildly aware, completely harmless. The man looking down at her was a police officer, late 30s, stocky build, the kind of jaw that seemed permanently set into mild contempt. His uniform was pressed, but his body language was not. Shoulders slightly forward, weight on his front foot, one hand resting near his belt. His nameplate read, Rowe. "You've been sitting here a while," he said. It wasn't a question. "Taking a break," Mara said. "Long shift. You work around here?" "Prentice Medical Center on Halcott Street." Officer Rowe looked at her scrubs, her bag, the stethoscope. His expression didn't change. "You got ID on you?" Something measured slid through Mara's awareness. This wasn't routine. Cops didn't card people sitting on park benches eating lunch. But she knew, with the trained instinct of someone who'd spent years reading rooms before entering them, that reacting to the wrongness of the question would be worse than answering it. "Sure," she said, and reached slowly into her bag. She produced her Mara Voss nursing ID. Laminated, worn at the edges, entirely legitimate. She held it out. He looked at it for longer than necessary. "This says you're a nurse. That's correct? What kind of nurse just sits in a park watching people?" In her earpiece, Darcy's voice came through on a closed channel. "We're picking this up on audio. Do not break cover. Repeat, do not break cover. T-minus 19 minutes. Mara kept her voice even. "The tired kind," she said. "I had a double. I wanted air before I drove home." Rowe handed the ID back without looking at her again. He moved around the bench, slow and deliberate, in a way that was designed to make her feel surrounded. "We've had some complaints. People loitering in this area, making residents uncomfortable. I'm eating lunch on a public bench. You've been here a while." "Yes, I already said that." He stopped in front of her, now fully blocking her line of sight to the east entrance where the courier would approach. Mara felt the particular frustration of someone who needed to do something important and was being stopped by someone who needed to feel powerful. She kept her hands still. She kept her face neutral. "I'm going to need you to move along," Rowe said. "This bench is in a high-traffic surveillance zone. We're asking people not to— There's no sign saying that." He blinked. People didn't interrupt him. She could see that in the slight pause, the recalibration. "Excuse me?" "If it were a restricted area, there'd be signage. There isn't. I'm on a public bench in a public park on my lunch break." She looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone who had once spent 9 hours in a surveillance hide in the rain without moving. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Rowe's jaw set harder. "I could make you move." "On what grounds?" The question landed flat. She watched it land. He hadn't expected her to ask it, and she could see him working backward from his own arrogance, trying to find a legal answer and not locating one. "Ma'am," he said, and the word carried the particular weight men like him used when they wanted to remind you of your size. "I'm trying to be polite here. I'm asking you to move." And I'm politely explaining that I don't have to. In her ear, "Mara." Darcy's voice was tighter now. "Courier may be early. We're picking up movement on the south path. Stay position." Rowe stepped closer, not aggressively, just close enough to make the air between them feel contested. "You want to do this the hard way?" "I want to eat my lunch," Mara said. "That's all I want to do." "Stand up." She looked at him for a moment, actually looked at him the way she rarely let herself look at people during operations, because real eye contact created real impressions that were hard to manage later. He had that particular blankness behind the authority that she'd seen before. Men who had been given power before they were ready for it and had arranged their whole identity around never being questioned. She stood up, slowly. Because the courier was 12 minutes away, and getting into a physical altercation with a uniformed officer in front of 12 surveillance agents would detonate everything they'd built. "Thank you," Rowe said, with the satisfaction of someone who had won something. She moved to the side of the bench, giving the appearance of compliance while staying within her sightline to the east entrance. But Rowe wasn't done. He moved with her. "Actually," he said, "I'm going to need you to leave the park." This was the moment she registered it clearly. This wasn't about her being suspicious. This was about him. Whatever had brought him to this bench, boredom, irritation, some quota that lived only in his head, he'd committed to this interaction, and he wasn't going to let it end without feeling like he'd won something significant. And the woman in scrubs with her sensible shoes and her paper lunch bag looked like someone who would let him win. She was calculating, constantly calculating. The courier was still minutes out. The surveillance team was watching, and they would see everything that followed, but their operational protocols were rigid. Mara needed to maintain cover until the drop was complete. Deputy Director Price had been explicit. Nothing compromised the collection of that storage device. Nothing. "I'm not going to leave the park," she said quietly. Rowe's hand moved to his radio. "Then we're going to have a problem." That would be unfortunate. He keyed the radio and called for a patrol unit, giving Mara's description in clipped, bored language. Scrubs. Female. Bench near the fountain. She felt the surveillance team listening, knew they were watching through lenses she couldn't see, knew Darcy was running decision trees in the van. But no one broke in. Protocol held. Rowe looked at her with the expression of someone who had just played a card he expected to end the game. "Backup's coming. At that point, if you don't comply, you're looking at obstruction." She wanted to say so many things. The weight of 11 months pressed against her sternum. She thought about the 3 previous investigations that had failed, about the informant who had taken a serious personal risk to make this drop possible, about the $60+ million that had moved through this city while people who should have stopped it looked the other way. Instead, she said, "Okay. Okay, what? Okay, I'll wait here while you do whatever it is you think you need to do." It wasn't submission, it was management. She could see he didn't entirely know the difference. Then Darcy's voice in her ear, taut and urgent. "Mara, courier is on the south path. You need to signal. 30 seconds. Rowe was still talking. Something about ordinances. Something about park regulations. She was fairly certain he was inventing, and she had 30 seconds to signal the surveillance team without moving in a way that would tip off the courier or give Rowe a reason to grab her. She reached into her paper bag, a perfectly natural gesture, and palmed the small infrared emitter disguised as a pen cap. She turned it twice between her fingers, the signal for "I see them," hold position, and set it on the bench arm. In the distance, past Rowe's shoulder, she saw him. The courier was a thin man in a dark green utility jacket, mid-40s, moving with the careful unhurriedness of someone who had done this before. He was following the south path toward the fountain, his left hand in his jacket pocket. That was where the drive would be. He was looking for a woman alone on a bench near the water, the description he'd been given. He was 60 feet away. Rowe followed her eyes. "Hey, I'm talking to you." "I know," she said. "I'm listening." "You don't look like you're listening." 50 feet. The courier hadn't seen the officer yet. His scan of the area was careful, practiced, but he was looking for a woman sitting alone, and right now Mara was standing next to a uniformed cop. The dynamic of the bench had changed. If the courier saw the uniform, he stopped. 45 feet. He stopped walking, and Mara saw the small recalibration in his posture, the slight lean back, the reassessment. This was the thing about professional couriers. They were trained to abort at the first sign of a compromise. In her ear, "He's hesitating. Mara, we need him to continue." She did the only thing she could think of. She turned to Rowe and said, quietly enough that it wouldn't carry, "Officer, I think I need to tell you something." He straightened, pleased with himself. "I'm listening." "I'm a diabetic. I was sitting because I got a little lightheaded. I have my monitor in my bag. I just need another minute before I'm okay to walk." She watched his face cycle through the math. Diabetic. Medical emergency. Nurse. He didn't want to be the officer who made a diabetic nurse collapse on a park path, not with the optics that created. The swagger recalibrated into something more bureaucratically cautious. "Fine," he said. 1 minute. She sat back down on the bench, and as she did, she turned slightly east, and she was alone on the bench again. A tired woman in scrubs, and the courier's scan reached her, and she met his eyes for exactly the length of time she'd been instructed to. No longer, no shorter. and she watched him make the decision. He kept walking. In her ear, "Courier is advancing. Excellent. Hold position. 30 feet, 20. Rowe had half turned away, focused on the approaching patrol car that was pulling up on the park road to the north, and in the gap of his attention, the courier reached the bench, sat one seat down, set his forearm on the armrest, and stood again 23 seconds later, continuing south along the path. The drive was underneath the bench slat, the broken one on the left side. Mara breathed. She did not move. Darcy's voice was calm and precise now. "We have confirmation. Package is in position. Arrest teams are on my signal. Mara, sit tight." But Rowe had returned, and he had brought a friend. The second officer was younger, maybe 26, with the uncomfortable posture of someone who hadn't entirely figured out what to do with the authority he'd been handed. His nameplate read Cassin. He hung back slightly, letting Rowe lead, which told Mara everything she needed to know about the dynamic between them. "Okay," Rowe said, and now his voice had shifted. Louder, performative, aware of an audience. "Your minute's up. I need you to stand and present your identification again." "I already showed you identification. Official identification. Government issued. I need a driver's license." She reached into her bag. She did not remove the FBI credentials that lived in a concealed pocket beneath the false bottom. Those would come later, and not on her initiative. She produced her driver's license and held it out. He took it, read it. "Mara Voss," he looked up. "You live on Prescott Hill?" "Yes." "Long way from Prentice Medical." "There's a bus route." He handed the license to Cassin. Cassin ran it. She could see him pulling out a handheld scanner, and came back with clean results, because Mara Voss was a real person with a real address and a real nursing license and absolutely zero criminal record. Rowe's expression shifted into something she recognized as the frustration of a person who had committed to a confrontation and was running out of justification for it. She had seen that expression become dangerous before. "I want you to empty your bag," he said. "I'm sorry?" "Your bag. Empty it." "You don't have grounds for a search." "I have reasonable suspicion." "Based on what?" "Based on the fact that you've been sitting in this park for hours and you're making people nervous." "Which people?" She looked around at the genuinely empty path around them. The nearest civilian was a jogger 50 meters away. "I've been eating lunch on a bench. There's no one here." "Ma'am, my name is Mara." The edge in her voice was small but real, and she let it be real because the Mara Voss on her nursing badge would have that edge by now. Tired, put upon, legitimately confused about why a uniformed officer was demanding to search her lunch bag on a public path. She let herself inhabit it completely. Rowe's hand came down on her shoulder. Not a grab, not quite, but a pressure, directional, designed to move her. "I'm not asking anymore." Darcy's voice in her ear. "Courier is clear of the area. Arrest teams are moving. Mara, you are clear to identify when ready. Repeat, you are clear." And across the park she heard it, the particular sound of multiple vehicle doors opening simultaneously, the sound she'd been waiting 11 months to hear, the sound of the operation finally arriving at its conclusion. Rowe heard it too, his hand lifted from her shoulder. He turned north toward the sound of the vehicles, toward the 6 dark SUVs that had appeared simultaneously on the park's 3 access roads, toward the agents in tactical vests spilling onto the path with the controlled efficiency of people who had rehearsed this moment until it was automatic. "What the?" Cassin started. Mara stood. She reached into the concealed pocket beneath the false bottom of her bag. She unclipped the credential wallet, held it up, and said, in a voice that was completely different from the one she'd been using for the past 22 minutes, not louder, not harder, just stripped of every pretense she'd been carrying, "Special Agent Mara Voss, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Organized Crime Division." She let the badge speak for a full 3 seconds before she continued. "Officer Rowe, Officer Cassin, you are both being recorded. You have been recorded since the beginning of this interaction, and I need you to step back from this bench and not touch anything in the immediate area. There is active federal evidence on this path." She looked at Rowe directly. "Do you understand what I just said to you?" Rowe's face had gone through several distinct phases in the past 4 seconds. She watched all of them. The SUVs reached the south entrance. The arrest teams were moving on the courier now, efficiently and without drama, And across the park, other agents were fanning out to secondary positions she'd mapped months ago. Darcy's voice. Courier is in custody. Package is secured. Good work, Mara. Come out. She lowered the badge. She looked at Officer Rowe, at the specific quality of his stillness, the way a man looked when the architecture of a situation had collapsed around him, and he hadn't yet decided how to move inside the rubble. Then Agent Yvonne Holt, the operational supervisor who'd been in the maintenance van on Whitmore Avenue for 4 hours, stepped onto the path. She was 52, had the bearing of someone who had been doing this since before Rowe was in uniform, and she walked directly to where the two officers stood without breaking stride. Officer Rowe, she said, producing her own credentials. I'm Supervisory Special Agent Holt. I'm going to need your badge number and your supervisor's contact information. She looked at his lapel camera. I'm also going to need your body camera footage for the past 30 minutes. Please don't turn it off. Rowe opened his mouth. That wasn't a request, Holt said pleasantly. The young officer, Cassin, took a small step backward. He was looking at Mara with the expression of someone watching a magic trick and trying to figure out where the bird had been. The park had become a different place in the span of 90 seconds. What had been a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a few joggers, a man walking a dog, a tired nurse on a bench, but was now an active federal operation. 6 vehicles, 14 agents visible, more in position on the streets surrounding the park. And at the center of it, Mara Voss stood in her worn blue scrubs, her paper lunch bag on the bench beside her, her FBI badge still in her hand, watching the specific expression on Marcus Rowe's face as the afternoon light shifted and the city began very slowly to understand what had just happened here. She felt the exhaustion of 2 years settle into her bones. She felt something else, too. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not anything clean or simple. More like the particular feeling of a door you'd been pushing against finally giving way, and the shock of momentum carrying you forward into a space you'd been imagining so long it didn't look the way you'd expected. Holt was already on the phone, and the words Mara caught were conduct review and field supervisor, and yes, tonight. The recording from Mara's concealed audio feed, every word Rowe had said, every demand, every threat, had already been transmitted to the surveillance van, already time-stamped, already logged. But then Agent Holt lowered her phone, and the expression on her face was not the expression of someone wrapping up a completed operation. It was the expression of someone who had just received information that changed the shape of everything. Mara, she said, and her voice was careful in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds ago. We have a problem. Mara looked at her. The drive, Holt said. Our tech team cracked the encryption in the field. She paused. It's not the financial routing documentation we expected. The park noise filled the silence between them, distant sirens, a car door, the sound of a courier being read his rights somewhere to the south. What is it? Mara asked. Holt held the phone out. On the screen was a single document photographed from the drive's decrypted contents. A list of names. A list of names Mara recognized from the past 2 years of investigation, from informant testimony, from financial records and surveillance logs. And at the bottom of the list, in the same typeface as all the others, was a name that made the breath go out of her completely. A name she recognized, not from the Vortex Collective. From inside the bureau, the name on the screen was Nolan Price. Mara read it twice, then a third time because the first 2 times felt like a malfunction in her own cognition. The kind of error your brain makes when it encounters something that structurally cannot be true and keeps running the input again, expecting a different result. Deputy Assistant Director Nolan Price. Her handler. The man who had designed this operation, who had recruited her personally, who had built the cover identity of Mara Voss from the ground up and overseen every decision made in the past 2 years. His name was on a list of individuals documented as having received payments from shell accounts connected to the Vortex Collective. Not as a target, not as an investigator, as a recipient. She handed the phone back to Holt without a word. She was aware of Officer Rowe still standing 6 feet away, aware of Cassin shifting his weight, aware of the operational activity continuing across the park. Arrests being made, perimeter being maintained, agents working through the choreography they'd rehearsed 100 times. Everything still moving, the machine still running. But the thing the machine had been built to find had turned out to be something else entirely, and only 2 people in this park understood that yet. How many names on the list? Mara asked. 11 confirmed. 7 we recognize from the collective's own internal ledger. 4 we don't. Holt's voice had gone very flat, the tone of someone compressing something large into a manageable shape so they could keep working. Price is the 4th. When were the payments made? The documentation suggests a period of roughly 18 months, starting approximately 8 months before this operation was authorized. Mara stood very still and did the math she didn't want to do. 8 months before the operation. That meant the payments had begun while Price was still building the case for it, while he was still in the planning stage, deciding which agent to recruit, how to structure the cover, what the operational objectives would be. Which meant he had known, from the beginning, what the operation was actually designed to do. Not dismantle the collective. Protect it. "Darcy," she said into her earpiece, "are you still on this channel?" "I'm here." Darcy's voice was careful. She'd been listening. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without logging it through the standard system." A pause. "Okay. Pull every communication Price sent to this operation in the last 90 days. Specifically, any transmissions that included operational timing, position details, or informant identity. Flag anything that went out in the 12-hour window before each of our 3 prior scheduled operations." Another pause, longer this time. "Mara, you're saying..." "I'm saying our last 3 operations collapsed, and I want to know if someone gave them a schedule." The silence on the channel was the particular silence of someone understanding the full shape of a thing they'd been standing too close to see. Then, "Give me 20 minutes. Holt was watching her. The 2 women looked at each other across the space of a realization neither had expected to be standing in today, in this park, with a courier in custody and a storage device that had just turned the whole investigation inside out. "We need to pull Rowe and Cass in," Mara said. "Right now, before they report back through normal channels." Already thinking it, Holt turned toward the 2 officers. "Gentlemen, I'm going to need you both to come with me. You're being retained as witnesses to a federal operation. Standard procedure." Rowe's expression had been cycling between confusion and indignation since Mara had shown her badge, but now it sharpened into something more calculating. "Witnesses to what?" "A federal operation that you inadvertently interfered with," Holt said smoothly. "We'll need your statements and your body camera footage reviewed before you return to duty. This is not negotiable, and it's not personal." "My sergeant, will be notified. Come with me, please." Cassine went without argument, following the path of least resistance the way young officers sometimes did when the situation exceeded their reference points. Rowe held for another 3 seconds, just long enough to make it feel like a choice, before he followed, his body language carrying the last residue of a man who still believed he was going to come out of this on top. Mara watched them go. Then she looked at the bench, the broken slat on the left side, where the drive had been left, where it had already been recovered and was currently in an evidence bag in one of the SUVs. The ordinary surface of an ordinary park bench that had just become the center of something much larger and more dangerous than a laundering case. She sat down on it. Not because she needed to, because her legs had made that decision independently, and she was too occupied with other calculations to argue with them. The paper bag from the deli was still there, the wax paper from her sandwich folded neatly inside. She'd eaten half of it. She hadn't tasted any of it. 2 years. She had given this operation 2 years. And the person who had designed it, who had held her cover in his hands, who had known every position she was in and every informant she'd spoken to, he had been on the other side the whole time, which meant the informant who had arranged today's drop had taken an enormous risk, and that risk may not have been as spontaneous as it appeared. If Price had known about the drop, if someone in the collective had told him, then the decision to let the drop proceed rather than abort it was intentional. They had let the courier walk in because they wanted the drive recovered, because the drive's contents were the message. The name on the list wasn't an oversight, it was a delivery. Someone inside the Vortex Collective had just handed the FBI evidence against its own deputy director. The question was why. She found Agent Holt 20 minutes later in the back of the command vehicle, a converted SUV with a fold-out workstation and enough encrypted comm equipment to run a small military operation. Darcy had joined them remotely, her voice through the laptop speakers, her face small and sharp on the screen. "I pulled the communications," Darcy said. "You're not going to like it." I already don't like it, Mara said. Tell me. 3 operations in the past 14 months. Dockside warehouse sweep in March. The Halverson restaurant raid in August. The freight terminal surveillance in November. All 3 were compromised between 6 and 18 hours before execution. She clicked through something on her end. In all 3 cases, operational timing and position details were transmitted through our secure internal relay. Price sent a routine briefing to the field office for each one. Standard format, standard protocol. Nothing that would have flagged a review. But those briefings included embedded field codes that aren't part of standard format. I almost missed them. They're formatted as timestamp corrections, nothing a routine audit would catch. They encode position coordinates and the operational lead's identification. The silence in the van was very dense. He was flagging our people, Mara said. He was flagging you specifically in the November transmission. The code sequence in the briefing corresponds to your cover identity's daily position report from the 48 hours prior. Mara thought about November. The freight terminal surveillance, which had collapsed when the collective's main logistics contact had abruptly left Delport for a business trip to Vancouver that no one had been able to explain. She had chalked it up to operational paranoia on the collective's part. They were careful people. They moved when they felt exposed. She had not considered that they moved because they had been told exactly who was watching and from where. He knew where I was, she said. Every time. Every time, Darcy confirmed, which means the only reason today worked is because the drop wasn't arranged by the informant. Mara looked at Holt. Or rather, the informant wasn't working for us. Holt was quiet for a moment. Say that clearly. The informant who made contact through the dead drop 3 days ago. I assumed they were inside the collective trying to help us. But if Price has been running interference for 18 months, any genuine informant would have been identified and removed long before they could make contact with this operation. She paused. The informant was placed. The drop was engineered. The drive with Price's name on it was delivered deliberately by someone who wanted us to find it. The collective set up their own courier to be arrested, Holt said slowly. Not just that. They put together documentation that implicates one of our own people in a way that's clean enough to hold up, specific enough to be actionable, and timed to land exactly when we'd have no choice but to open an internal investigation. She looked at the laptop screen. Someone in the Vortex Collective wants Price burned, Darcy said quietly. He outlived his usefulness. Or he got greedy. Or he tried to move the relationship in a direction they didn't like. Mara pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. The exhaustion that had settled into her bones 40 minutes ago had shifted into something sharper. The particular fatigue of a mind that couldn't stop working even when it desperately needed to. Either way, they're using us to do it. They hand us the evidence, we open the investigation, Price goes down, and whatever damage he's caused them gets neutralized while they walk away clean. So we let them do it, Holt said. Mara looked at her. Price is guilty, Holt said. The documentation is real. Our tech team has confirmed the account structures. The payments are real. If someone inside the collective decided to give us the means to prove it, the origin of that decision doesn't change the evidence. It changes the shape of what we're walking into, Mara said. If they burned Price because they wanted to contain something, that means there's something to contain. And if we move on Price without knowing what that is, we might close one door and miss what's behind it. Holt finished the sentence. She looked at the workstation. Okay, what do you need? I need 48 hours, and I need Price to not know the drive exists yet. He'll know the operation ran today. It's in the field log. Field logs can be incomplete for 48 hours if the operational supervisor files a preliminary hold pending evidence processing. That's within protocol. She looked at Holt. You're the operational supervisor. Holt considered that for a long moment. She was, Mara understood, being asked to make a choice that sat in a gray area she hadn't expected to be navigating today. In a park, after what was supposed to be a controlled arrest operation. Holt had spent 30 years doing things correctly, and the correct thing and the right thing were not always the same shape. 48 hours, Holt said finally. Then this goes to the Inspector General's office, and we do it by the book. Agreed. What are you going to do in 48 hours? Find out what Price was actually protecting, Mara said, because it wasn't just money. She went back to the apartment that had been Mara Voss's home for 2 years. It was a studio on the fourth floor of a building on Prescott Hill. The address on her driver's license, the address she'd given Rowe. She'd chosen it herself at the start of the operation, close enough to the hospital to be plausible, far enough from the Bureau's Delport field office to avoid incidental recognition. The furniture was minimal and deliberately impersonal, the kind of apartment a nurse working double shifts maintained, not out of choice, but out of absence. There were medical textbooks on the shelf, a nursing uniform hanging on the back of the bathroom door, a half-dead plant on the windowsill that she kept alive out of a stubbornness she couldn't fully explain. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and her FBI credentials in front of her, and she thought about Nolan Price. She had met him 4 years ago at a conference in Portland. He'd been the lead presenter on a panel about deep cover operations in organized crime environments, methodological innovations, improved informant protection protocols, lessons from failed operations in other field offices. He had been precise and unflashy and occasionally funny in the dry, understated way of people who had spent too much time in rooms where humor was a survival mechanism. She had asked 3 questions during the Q&A. He'd answered 2 of them completely and flagged the third as something worth discussing offline. 3 weeks later, he'd offered her the Vortex operation. She had believed in him. That was the honest accounting of it. Not naively. She wasn't a person who trusted easily, and the professional relationship they'd maintained over 2 years had never been warm exactly. But she had believed that his commitment to the operation was real, that his judgment could be relied upon, that the architecture he'd built for her cover was designed to protect her and the mission. Now she was wondering how much of that architecture had been designed to protect something else entirely. She opened her laptop and pulled up everything she had access to on the Vortex Collective structure. The organizational map the Bureau had built over 14 months, the financial flows, the personnel files. She'd spent so long inside this material that she could navigate it the way you navigated a house you'd lived in for years, moving through it in the dark by memory. But she was looking for something different now. Not evidence of the collective's crimes, evidence of what they were protecting that was valuable enough to require a deputy director of the FBI. 2 hours in, she found it. It was buried in an 18-month-old financial report that had been generated by the Bureau's forensic accounting team and then quietly archived without follow-up. The collective's freight logistics front, a company called Halcyon Transit, had flagged an anomalous payment pattern 18 months ago. The payments weren't to or from the collective's standard shell network. They were passing through an entirely separate set of accounts that the forensic team had noted, flagged as possibly connected to a third-party entity, and then apparently decided not to pursue. The report had been archived by Deputy Director Price. She pulled Halcyon Transit's filing history. The third-party accounts connected to 2 LLCs registered in Delaware, standard practice for anyone wanting to obscure ownership. One of those LLCs had a registered agent whose name she didn't recognize. The other had a registered agent named Raymond Stolk. She searched Stolk. He appeared in exactly 3 places in the Bureau's database. A passing reference in a 2019 organized crime brief about Delport's construction industry. A note in the deactivated file of a previous FBI investigation, one of the ones that had collapsed before Mara's operation began. And a cross-reference in a Delport Police Department internal affairs inquiry from 2 years ago that had been suspended without resolution. The internal affairs inquiry was flagged with a reviewing officer's name, Lieutenant Conrad Faber, Delport PD's liaison to the FBI's field office, the same field office that handled communications for Mara's operation. She sat with that for a moment, her hands still on the keyboard, the apartment very quiet around her. The plant on the windowsill needed water. She noticed that without doing anything about it. She pulled the suspended internal affairs file. It was thin. 3 pages of initial intake documentation, a witness list that had never been interviewed, a closing note that cited lack of evidence. The complaint had originated from inside the department. An officer raising concerns about property evidence being accessed outside of normal logging procedures. The officer's name was on the 2nd page. She read it twice. Then she pulled up the body camera footage archive request she'd filed for Officer Marcus Rowe at the park. Rowe's personnel file, which Holt had obtained during the witness retention process, showed his assignment history. Traffic enforcement for 3 years, then a lateral transfer 18 months ago to the downtown district. The requesting supervisor for his transfer was listed as Lieutenant Conrad Faber, the officer who had walked up to a bench in Caldwell Riverside Park and decided, apparently on instinct, to harass a woman in scrubs. That officer had been placed in that district by the same lieutenant whose name appeared in an archived document connecting him to a company connected to the Vortex Collective's money, which had been protected by a deputy director who was now implicated on a storage device that the collective had deliberately allowed to be recovered. None of this was coincidence. She closed the laptop. She needed to think, and she couldn't think here, in this apartment that had been Mara Voss's life for 2 years, surrounded by the evidence of a cover that had been penetrated more completely than she had understood. She stood, put her jacket on, clipped her credentials to her belt where she could feel the weight of them, and went to the window. Delport at night looked like ambition from up here. The glass buildings caught the harbor lights. Traffic moved through the grid in orderly patterns. Down on the street below, a couple walked a dog, and a food delivery cyclist ran a red light, and a man in a gray coat stood on the corner opposite and looked up at the building. She looked back at him. He looked away. She watched him for 30 seconds. He didn't look up again. He pulled out a phone, appeared to check something, and walked south. A normal person on a normal night. She stayed at the window for another full minute before she moved away from it. Her phone buzzed. Darcy. She answered without speaking. "I found something," Darcy said, and her voice had the same quality Holtz had in the park. The flatness of compression, of making something large fit inside a working sentence. "I ran the name Raymond Stolk through FinCEN's database instead of ours." "And?" "He's a nominee director, name for hire, used to provide legal cover for ownership structures where the real owner doesn't want to appear in public records. He's associated with 14 registered entities across 6 states. 11 of them are defunct. 3 are active." "Which 3? "One is the LLC I assume you already found. The second is a real estate holding company in Delport with 3 commercial properties." Darcy paused. "The third one is registered in Virginia. It's a private security consulting firm, 12 employees, government contracts." Mara was very still. "What kind of government contracts?" "The public-facing kind that don't tell you much. DoD subcontracting, general services, nothing specific in the open filing." Another pause. "But the firm's listed point of contact for 2 of those contracts is a federal employee. I had to dig through 3 layers of interagency directories to find the name." "Darcy." "The name is Wallace Greer," Darcy said, "Deputy Chief of Staff for the FBI's Pacific Northwest Regional Office. He reports directly to the Assistant Director." The apartment was very quiet. "He's 2 levels above Price," Mara said. "Yes." "Which means Price wasn't protecting the Vortex Collective for money. He was protecting someone above him," Darcy said. "And someone above him decided he'd become a liability." Mara looked at the window. The man in the gray coat was gone. The street was ordinary and indifferent, the way streets were. "If Greer finds out we have the drive," she said slowly, "he'll know what's coming before we can move on it. And if he knows what's coming, he has the resources to make it disappear. The filing, the evidence, us." Darcy's voice was flat. "Mara, we need to move fast and we need to move outside the normal chain of command. Which means we can't go to Price, we can't go to the field office, and we absolutely cannot brief anyone in the regional chain." "Then we go lateral," Mara said. "Inspector General directly. Tonight, not in 48 hours." Holt agreed to 48. Holt agreed before we knew there was a second name. She picked up her keys. "I'll call her. I need you to do one more thing." "What?" "Officer Rowe, the one from the park. Pull everything on him, not just his personnel file. His financials, his communication history, anything FinCEN or the tax division has." "You think he was planted there today?" "I think someone knew the operation was running today. I think someone knew approximately where I'd be. And I think a uniformed officer showing up to harass me, right now, right there, is a very specific kind of problem that doesn't happen by accident." She grabbed her jacket. "And I think Marcus Rowe has no idea how deep the water is that someone dropped him into." She was halfway to the door when her phone buzzed again. Not Darcy this time. An unknown number. No area code she recognized. The kind of formatting that usually meant a burner or a routed line. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, and completely unfamiliar. "Special Agent Voss," it said. "Don't go to the Inspector General tonight. I know you found the second name. I know what you're planning. And if you move in the next 12 hours, 2 people die before morning. Neither of them the people you're trying to stop. She stopped walking. Who is this? She said. Someone who's been inside this longer than you have, the voice said. Someone who has been waiting for that drive to surface for a very long time. A pause. The collective didn't burn Price to protect themselves. They burned him because they're afraid of what he was about to do. He found something, Agent Voss. Something that goes further than Greer, further than the regional office. He was going to bring it to you. The silence stretched between them. Meet me, the voice said. I'll show you what Price actually found, before someone makes sure you never get to see it. She didn't answer immediately. That was training, not hesitation, but the deliberate pause of someone who understood that the first response to an unexpected contact set the entire tone of what followed. She stood in her apartment hallway, jacket half on, keys in her right hand, and she listened to the quality of the silence on the other end of the line. Breathing, steady. Someone who had made this call before and wasn't nervous about it. I don't meet strangers on anonymous calls, she said. That's a reasonable policy, the voice said, which is why I'm going to give you something first, something you can verify before you decide. A pause. In the archived FinCEN cross-reference for Halcyon Transit, the one you pulled 2 hours ago, there's a secondary notation in the metadata. File stamp 0047R. It was added 14 months ago by a user with restricted bureau access. Pull the access log. The user ID traces to a terminal in the regional office, room 412. That room is assigned to a senior analyst named Porter Weld. She said nothing. Porter Weld resigned from the bureau 11 months ago, the voice continued, officially for personal reasons, unofficially because he found the same financial thread you found tonight and brought it to his supervisor. His supervisor was Wallace Greer. Another pause. Weld is alive. He's careful. He's been waiting for someone to find what he left in that file. And you're Weld, she said. No, the voice said, but I know where he is, and he has everything Price found before the collective decided Price had become a problem. The voice shifted slightly, not warmer, but less formal, the way someone sounded when they dropped a register of performance. I've been running parallel to your operation for 8 months, Agent Voss. I know what you built. I know what it cost. I'm not your enemy. You're also not identified. Not on this call. At the meet, yes. He gave her an address, a parking structure on the east side of the harbor, 3rd level, 11 p.m. Then he said, verify the file stamp first. That's all I'm asking. If it's not there, don't come. The line went dead. She stood in the hallway for 6 seconds, then put her jacket on the rest of the way and called Darcy. The file stamp was there. Darcy found it in 4 minutes. The metadata notation buried in the archived FinCEN cross-reference, exactly where the caller had said. The user ID pulled to a terminal in room 412 of the regional office. The room assignment matched Porter Weld's bureau personnel file. The timestamp was 14 months ago, 2 weeks before Weld's resignation. It's real, Darcy said, and she didn't sound relieved. She sounded like someone who had been hoping it wouldn't be. Mara, this is too clean. Someone who knows our database well enough to leave a verifiable trail in archived metadata is someone who also knows how to use that knowledge against us. I know. So don't go. If they wanted to move against us tonight, they didn't need to call. She was already checking her sidearm, not the registered bureau weapon, the backup piece she carried in the concealed holster she'd worn every day for 2 years, the one that didn't appear in standard operational inventory. They could have gone to Greer the moment we pulled the drive. We'd already be dealing with the consequences of that. Unless calling you is the consequence. She thought about that. Get Holt. Tell her what happened. Don't brief anyone else. Not the field office, not the duty supervisor. Only Holt. And if Holt says don't go, then we have a disagreement, Mara said, and ended the call. What? She called Holt from the car. Holt listened without interrupting. A discipline Mara had come to rely on, that quality of attention that didn't rush to fill silence. When Mara finished, the pause before Holt spoke was exactly long enough to be genuine. The metadata check is solid, Holt said. That's a real data point from a real file. But a real data point doesn't mean the source is trustworthy. It means the source has access. Yes. Who has the kind of access to know where we're looking in real time tonight, within 2 hours of us finding the drive? Someone inside the operation, or someone monitoring a channel we use. Or someone who anticipated we'd pull that file once we had Price's name. Holt was quiet again. Which means they may have been watching that file for months, waiting for someone to access it. Weld's breadcrumb, Mara said, left there for whoever found the thread. And our anonymous caller is either Weld himself, someone protecting Weld, or someone who found the breadcrumb before us and is using it as bait. Holt exhaled, the sound of a woman calculating risk in real time. I can have 2 agents on the 3rd level of that structure before you arrive. Plain clothes, independent approach. You wouldn't see them, neither would he. If he's surveilling the location before 11, he might. It's a risk either way. I know. She turned onto the harbor road, the water dark and flat on her right, the city lights fractured on the surface. Don't put anyone on the floor, put them on the exits. If it goes wrong, I want movement contained, not intervention. Mara, I've been alone in rooms with worse people than an anonymous caller for 2 years, Yvonne. The use of Holt's first name sat in the space between them for a moment. They'd never used first names before tonight. I know you have, Holt said finally. Exits only. Check in at 10:45 and at 11:05. If I don't hear from you at 11:05, I'm sending everyone in. Agreed. She parked 2 blocks from the structure and walked the rest of the way, using the time to let her eyes adjust, and her awareness settle into the particular quality of attention she'd been trained for. Not hypervigilance, which was exhausting and inaccurate, but the steady, wide-angle receptiveness of someone who had learned to take in an environment without actively scanning it. She noted the cars in the lot. The attendant booth was unmanned at this hour, an elevator and a stairwell on the north end. The structure was open-sided, each level a concrete shelf exposed to the harbor air. The 3rd level would have sight lines in multiple directions. She took the stairs. The 3rd level was mostly empty. 7 cars scattered. The air smelled of salt water and motor oil, and the particular coldness of concrete that had never fully warmed even in summer. She positioned herself near the east wall, with sight lines to both the stairwell and the elevator, and she waited. At 10:50, a car she hadn't heard on the ramp appeared from the west end of the level. It parked 20 meters away. The lights cut off. A man got out. He was mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, the kind of build that had been muscular once and settled into something denser and less defined. He was wearing a dark jacket and moving with a careful, joint-conscious walk that told her his knees were bad. He stopped 10 feet from her, hands visible, and she clocked every detail in the 2 seconds before he spoke. Agent Voss, you're going to tell me your name before we have any further conversation, she said. Marcus eyed, he said. I was a DEA senior agent for 16 years. I've been retired for 3. He reached slowly into his jacket and produced a card. Not a business card. A laminated credential of the kind retired federal employees sometimes kept. She didn't take it yet. I worked a parallel investigation into the Vortex Collective starting 4 years ago, before your operation existed. The DEA closed my case 18 months ago at the request of an interagency coordination committee. I know now that Greer was on that committee. She took the card, examined it, kept her expression neutral. How do you know Porter Weld? Weld contacted me 9 months ago. He'd found the financial thread, same as you did tonight, and he'd made the mistake of going to Greer. When Greer buried it, Weld left the bureau and went looking for someone outside the chain who already knew the landscape. I'd shifted his weight. His right knee, she thought. He came to me because I'd lost my own investigation the same way. We've been building a case since then, independently, outside any bureau or DEA channel. Where's Weld now? Safe house in Marlow County, about 90 minutes from here. He looked at her steadily. He has everything. The financial documentation Price assembled before the collective decided to burn him. Communications between Greer and senior collective members going back 2 years. Evidence of 3 separate instances where ongoing federal investigations were deliberately compromised by information passed through Greer's office. The harbor wind moved through the open structure. Somewhere below, a car turned onto the ramp. Why come to me now, she said. Tonight, because the drive was always the trigger, I'd said. Weld left the notation in that file specifically because he expected someone to find the financial thread eventually, if the right operation got close enough. When that file was accessed tonight, it sent an alert to a secure channel Weld set up. We knew you'd found the thread, we knew you'd moved toward the IG. He paused. And we knew that if you went to the IG through normal channels tonight, Greer would know within the hour. You're saying he has a contact in the IG's office? I'm saying he has contacts in multiple oversight bodies, and we can prove it. Eid reached into his jacket again and produced a thumb drive. Not the one from the park bench, a different one, matte black and smaller. This is a portion of what Weld has. Enough for you to verify the broader case before you decide whether to come to Marlow County. She looked at the drive. I'm not plugging an unverified drive into anything connected to our network. It's not for your network. It's for you, personally. Offline machine, air-gapped. Take it or don't. He held it out with a steadiness that communicated patience rather than pressure. We're not asking you to trust us. We're asking you to look at the evidence. She took the drive. Not because she trusted him, because the alternative was walking away from the only lead that went above price, and she'd spent 2 years not walking away from things that were hard to look at. I need 12 hours, she said. You have 8, I'd said. At sunrise, Weld moves. There's a reason for the timing. He turned back toward his car. The collective doesn't know Weld exists, but Greer has been looking for the person who left that notation for 11 months. He's getting closer. He stopped with his hand on the car door. You found the notation tonight. If Greer is monitoring that file's access log the way we think he is, he knows someone accessed it. He doesn't know it was you, but he'll start narrowing it down by morning. He got in the car. She watched him drive toward the ramp and disappear. She stood on the 3rd level of the parking structure for 90 seconds, the thumb drive in her jacket pocket, the harbor wind pulling at her collar. Then she checked in with Holt at exactly 11:05. She used the laptop in Holt's command vehicle, isolated from every bureau network, running on a clean OS. Darcy had loaded onto a spare machine 3 months ago for exactly the kind of situation where their standard infrastructure couldn't be trusted. The files on Ide's drive took 4 minutes to load, then another 20 to begin to comprehend. Weld had been thorough in the meticulous, slightly compulsive way of someone who had known they'd get one shot at this. The financial documentation was granular. Account numbers, routing sequences, payment dates, corresponding communication timestamps, the kind of record that didn't leave interpretive room. But it was the communication archive that made Mara stop and read slowly, which she almost never did anymore. Greer had been careful. His communications with collective members never named them directly, never named himself directly, used a rotating series of encrypted channels that would have been extremely difficult to trace without knowing where to look. But Weld had known where to look because he'd pulled Greer's communication logs from his own bureau access before he resigned. Technically a breach of protocol, and therefore inadmissible through normal channels, but sufficient to provide a roadmap. The communications documented something more specific than a financial arrangement. Greer had not simply been taking money to suppress investigations. He had been actively advising the collective on law enforcement strategy, warning them which agents were getting close, recommending which fronts to shift of operational moves. The relationship was collaborative, detailed, and ran through the precise period when 3 separate investigations, including 2 of the FBI's and 1 of the DEA's, had collapsed. He had been managing them, not just protecting them, actually managing the collective's exposure to federal law enforcement as a professional service. Mara sat back from the screen. The scope of it was larger than she'd let herself consider in the car. She had been thinking about price, about a compromised handler, a betrayed operation, the particular damage of 2 years built on a foundation someone had quietly been eroding the entire time. But this was not about price. Price was the middle layer. Greer was the architecture. And if Greer had been doing this for as long as the documentation suggested, 4 years, possibly longer, then the question of how many operations had been damaged, how many investigations had been redirected, how many people inside the Bureau had built careers on information that was being filtered before it reached them? That was a question she wasn't going to be able to answer tonight in a parking structure command vehicle. How much of this did you know? She asked Holt. Holt was reading over her shoulder. Her face was doing the same compression thing it had done in the park, the effort of fitting something very large into a working expression. None of it, she said. Mara, I want to be honest with you. If I'd had any indication that I know. She did know. Holt was clean. She'd known that before tonight because she'd spent 2 years reading people, and Holt read like someone who had given her career to this work without reservation, which was its own kind of exhausting and its own kind of proof. I'm not asking because I doubt you. I'm asking because I need to know where the perimeter is. You mean who we can bring in? Yes. Holt straightened up. The IG's office has a protected disclosure channel that bypasses regional oversight. It's slow, designed for whistleblowers, not emergency interventions. But there's a deputy IG named Sylvie Ibarra who has run 3 independent oversight reviews in the past 5 years and has a documented history of keeping regional chain out of her process. She looked at the screen. If I call her tonight, not through the system, personally, on her direct line, I can brief her on what we have. She can open an emergency protective review that shields both of us and everything we've collected from Greer's reach before morning. Can she move fast enough? Faster than the alternative. Holt met her eyes. But if we do that, we can't also go to Marlow County. We commit to the institutional path. Or I go to Marlow County and you call Ibarra. We'd be splitting the operation. We'd be splitting the risk, Mara said. If Greer is monitoring and something moves tonight, I'd rather have 2 threads he needs to cut than 1. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Bassem. Mara drove to Marlow County alone. She'd called Darcy twice during the drive. Once to confirm that the access log for the archived FinCEN file had not been pulled by anyone in the regional office since her own access 2 hours ago, and once to update her on what the drive contained. Darcy had listened without speaking and then said, in a voice that was very controlled, Mara, if this is all real, it is, then this doesn't end with an arrest. This ends with a restructuring of half the Bureau's Pacific Northwest operations. I know. And everyone who's been working in good faith under that structure, every agent who ran a case that got quietly directed somewhere it couldn't do damage, they're going to have to reckon with that. I know, Darcy. A long silence. Okay, Darcy said, which meant something different than agreement. It meant I'm still here, and that was enough. The safe house was a property outside the town of Marlow, a rural double-wide on a gravel road, the kind of structure that was neither notable nor overlooked, a nothing place in a nothing county that had probably never hosted a federal investigation before. Ide was already there when she arrived. He opened the door before she knocked, which told her he'd been watching the road, and he led her through a hallway stacked with document boxes to a back room where a man was sitting at a folding table with a laptop and a cold cup of coffee. Porter Weld was younger than she'd expected. Mid-40s, slight, with the specific kind of dark circles that came from sustained disrupted sleep rather than one bad night. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face was the exact expression she'd seen on informants who had been carrying something dangerous for too long, and finally saw someone they could hand it to. Special Agent Voss, he said. Just Mara, she said, because the formality felt wrong in this room. He nodded. I've been trying to get this material to someone who could use it for 8 months. He put his hand on a file folder at the edge of the table. Every time I thought I'd found a path in, it closed. Tell me what Price found, she said. Not what's in the documentation, what he found that scared them enough to burn him. Weld looked at Ide briefly, then back at her. Price found a name, he said, not Greer, above Greer. He opened the folder. The Vortex Collective isn't what your operation thought it was. The financial crimes, the laundering, the front companies, that's the surface layer. Underneath it, the collective has been functioning as a private intelligence gathering operation for a network of individuals with significant federal connections. They've been collecting compromising material on law enforcement personnel across 5 states. Price found the archive. He slid a single page across the table. The person who controls that archive is not in law enforcement, not in government. He paused. But they own the people who are. She looked at the page. It was a partial organizational diagram, hand-drawn, careful, the work of someone who had assembled it piece by piece over a long time. At the center of it was a name she didn't recognize, Aldrich Soren. Who is he, she said. Publicly, a private equity investor based in Portland. Legitimate business interests in shipping, commercial real estate, regional media. Weld's voice was even, the practiced flatness of someone who had rehearsed this and still found it hard to say. Privately, he's been funding the collective's infrastructure for 6 years, not for profit, for access. He uses the collective's intelligence archive to maintain leverage over people in federal law enforcement and state government. Price wasn't just being paid, he was being managed. The room was very quiet. Price figured this out, Mara said. He started putting it together about 4 months ago. He came to us, to Ide, through an intermediary. He wanted out. He wanted to trade what he knew about Soren for a deal. Weld looked down at the table. He reached out to the wrong person first, someone who warned Soren before Price could complete the contact. So the collective didn't burn Price because he was a liability, Mara said slowly. They burned him because he was about to expose Soren. And burning him through us, handing the Bureau evidence against Price, neutralizes Price without Soren's name ever coming up. Soren stays clean, Ide said from behind her. Price goes to prison. The Bureau closes the case as an internal corruption matter, and everything above Price stays exactly where it is. She stood up from the chair. It was a very elegant architecture, and she hated how much she could see the craftsmanship in it. Every move designed to contain the damage at the layer below. Greer protected by Price, Soren protected by Greer. The whole structure tiered so that any investigation that got close enough to be dangerous would find exactly enough wrongdoing at the lower level to satisfy itself and stop. You said Price was about to bring this to me, she said. He sent a message to Ide 48 hours ago, Weld said. He had a secondary copy of the archive documentation. He was going to transmit it to you directly, bypassing Greer entirely. He thought you were the one person in his operational chain who hadn't been touched. Was he right? He was right about you, Weld said. He was wrong about the timing. Someone intercepted his message to Ide. Not the content, just the fact of the contact. That was enough. He looked at her steadily. Price is in protective custody tonight. Greer's people got to him 3 hours before the park operation ran. He's not at risk, but he's not accessible. They have him contained in a private medical facility in the city. The bottom dropped out of the floor she'd been standing on. A medical facility, she said. Prentice Medical Center, Weld said. Prentice Medical Center. Her hospital. The hospital on Halcott Street that was on her nursing ID, that she had walked through every week for 2 years as Mara Voss, whose staff knew her face and her name and her coffee order and which break room she preferred on long shifts. The place where she had been real for a while. Where Nolan Price was now being held. Not by law enforcement, not in any system she could access through a badge or a warrant, but in a private room in a building she knew better than almost any other place in this city, where he was either being kept quiet or being made to disappear, and where, in approximately 4 hours, the morning shift would begin, the staff would rotate, and whatever window existed to reach him would close with a finality that no legal mechanism would be fast enough to reopen. Mara looked at Weld. She looked at E-Day. She looked at the organizational diagram with Aldrich Soren's name at the center of it. Then she looked at her jacket, hanging on the back of the chair where she'd put it when she sat down. The nursing scrubs were in her car. She'd never taken them out of the trunk. She changed in the car. Not elegantly. She was sitting in the driver's seat of a sedan on a gravel road at 2 a.m. with a document box pressing into her left shoulder and the overhead light off because she didn't want to be visible from the road. The scrubs were wrinkled from being folded in the trunk for 14 hours, which was fine. Mara Voss would have wrinkled scrubs. Mara Voss had been on a long shift. Mara Voss was always tired in a way that was completely believable because it was completely real. She tucked the FBI credentials into the hidden pocket of her bag. She put the nursing ID on the lanyard around her neck. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror for 3 seconds, the flat assessment of someone checking a piece of equipment before deploying it. And then she called Holt. "Tell me you have something," she said. "Ibarra is moving." Holt's voice was tight with controlled urgency. "She opened an emergency protective review 40 minutes ago. It creates a sealed evidentiary record that Greer can't access or modify through normal channels. Anything we submit to it is protected." A pause. "But Mara, she needs Price's testimony. If he can corroborate the documentation on Soren, I know. That's why I'm going in. Into Prentice. Into Prentice." Holt was quiet for exactly the length of time it took to weigh something she didn't want to weigh. "You don't have a legal basis to access a patient. If Price is being held under a false admission, he's being held in a building where I have a 2-year employment history and a staff ID that still works." She clipped the stethoscope around her neck. "I'm not arresting him. I'm visiting a patient. If Greer's people are watching that facility, then I'm a nurse coming in for an early shift, and I've done it 500 times before, and I look exactly like someone who belongs there." She pulled the visor down and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Yvonne, the review window closes at sunrise. We both know that." Another pause. "Check in every 20 minutes. If you miss a check-in, I'm calling it. Understood. And Mara, don't be a hero about this. If it's not accessible, you walk out. I know how to walk out of a building, she said, and ended the call. But Prentice Medical Center at 3 a.m. was a specific ecosystem she knew in her bones. The overnight skeleton crew. The particular smell of floor cleaner and recycled air that hit you at the main entrance. The security desk staffed by a rotating cast of contract guards who had learned over time that the nursing staff moved fast and didn't stop to chat, and that stopping them for ID checks created friction that their supervisors didn't want. She had walked through that lobby hundreds of times. She had calibrated her pace, her expression, her level of visible tiredness to match the environment so completely that she'd stopped thinking about it. She stopped thinking about it now. The guard at the desk was a man she half recognized. She'd seen him on previous overnight rotations but didn't know his name. He glanced up when she pushed through the door, clocked the scrubs and the lanyard, and looked back down at his screen. She swiped her ID badge at the inner door out of habit. It beeped green. Her access had never been revoked because no one had any reason to revoke it, because Mara Voss was a legitimate employee who had simply been working fewer shifts lately. She walked to the elevator. The patient directory was the first problem. She needed a room number, and she couldn't access the patient directory without a clinical reason, and she couldn't invent a clinical reason without knowing the admission name. Price would not have been admitted under his own name. Whoever had arranged this would have used something clean, a private admission under a false identity, the kind of arrangement that existed in every large medical center for a variety of reasons, both legitimate and not, and that the overnight administrative staff had neither the access nor the inclination to question. She took the elevator to 4, the medical telemetry unit, where private pay patients with ambiguous admission statuses were sometimes placed. She knew this floor specifically because she'd rotated through it during one of her genuine nursing assignments. She pushed through the unit doors. The charge nurse at the station was a woman named Tilda. She remembered Tilda, who was efficient and humorless and ran her floor with the kind of rigid consistency that Mara had always privately respected. Tilda looked up. "Voss," she said, with the mild surprise of someone seeing a colleague slightly out of context. "You're not on tonight." "I know. I'm picking up a few hours. Ask Dr. Reyes about a patient consult." She said it with the tired confidence of someone who had done this before, because she had, once, 14 months ago, when she'd needed to extend her presence in the building past a normal shift. "Private admit? I don't have the room number. They may have come in through the south entrance." Tilda's expression flickered. The brief assessment of a nurse who ran a tight ship and was deciding whether this request fit within acceptable parameters. "What's the name?" "I was given a file notation. Langford, I think. Or it might be under an initial. Dr. Reyes's handwriting is what it is." Tilda turned to her screen. She typed. She was quiet for 4 seconds that felt longer. "Room 418. Dr. Paulson's patient, not Reyes." "Right, sorry, I misread the note." She kept her expression on the mild side of apologetic. "Thank you." She walked toward 418 without hesitation, because hesitation was the thing that created questions. The hallway outside 418 was quiet. She passed 2 rooms before it, both with doors partially open, patients visible in the dim light. She noted the door to 488 was closed, which was not unusual on this floor at this hour, and that there was no visible presence outside it, which was either reassuring or deliberate. She pressed the door handle and walked in. The room was dim, the monitor beside the bed showing stable vitals, the IV line running clear. The man in the bed was awake. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, the voluntary nature of it, the way a person held themselves when they were choosing not to move rather than unable to. He turned his head when she entered. Nolan Price looked like a man who had been through several kinds of difficult in a short period of time. His face was gray with fatigue and something else, a particular quality of defeat that went beyond physical exhaustion. She didn't know if she'd expected something more composed from him or something more dramatic. What she got was a 60-year-old man in a hospital gown who looked, very simply, like he was done pretending. "Mara," he said. "I'm not here as your case officer," she said quietly, pulling the door closed behind her. "And we have about 10 minutes before someone notices I'm in here." "How did you find me?" Porter Weld. His eyes closed briefly. "Weld is alive." "Yes. And he has everything you were trying to get to us. She moved to the chair beside the bed, not because she was comfortable, but because standing over him felt wrong for what she needed from this conversation. I need you to tell me about Aldrich Soren, not what's in the documentation, what you know. He looked at the ceiling. She could see him deciding something. Not whether to tell her, she thought, but how to begin. People who had been carrying a secret for a long time sometimes had trouble locating the start of it. Soren approached me 3 years ago, he said. Not directly. Through an intermediary. The framing was that he had intelligence assets that could benefit federal investigations, private sector intelligence gathering, the kind of thing that supplemented bureau capabilities in areas where we had limited reach, he paused. It sounded legitimate. Some of it was. For the first year, the information he passed through actually produced results. And then the arrangement changed. Gradually. The way those things always change gradually. He turned his head to look at her. He started asking for things in return. Small things at first. Confirmation that certain investigations were active. Timeline information. Nothing that seemed operationally sensitive. His jaw tightened. By the time I understood what I was inside, I was already inside it. The payments were documented. Everything was documented. That's how he works. He builds the leverage before you know you need to be afraid of it, she said. The documentation of the arrangement is the leverage. He doesn't need to threaten you. He just needs to exist. Price's voice was flat. Greer was already in before I was brought in. He's been in for 5 years. Soren builds these things slowly. He finds people at the right moment, when they're frustrated, when they feel undervalued, when they've done good work that didn't get recognized. He makes them feel seen. She thought about that. The particular cruelty of it. I need you to make a statement, she said. Formal, protected disclosure directly to Deputy IG Ibarra. If you corroborate the documentation Weld has and connect it specifically to Soren, Ibarra can move on him before he has time to trigger whatever contingency he has in place. He'll burn everything, Price said. The archive, the documentation trail. He has redundancies I don't know the full shape of. Weld anticipated that. He has a copy of the archive that Soren doesn't know exists. She leaned forward slightly. Nolan, if you don't put your name to this, the case against Soren dies at the documentation level. He walks away from all of it. Greer takes the fall, you take the fall, and in 5 years he builds it again with different people. The monitor beeped steadily. Outside the window, Delport's harbor lights made a dim glow against the pre-dawn sky. I was going to burn the whole thing, Price said quietly. When I decided to contact Ide, I was going to give you everything and trust that you'd... He stopped. I should have come to you directly, 18 months ago. She didn't tell him that 18 months ago she might not have had the infrastructure to protect him. She didn't tell him what those 18 months had cost. There wasn't time for any of that, and the accounting of it would come later, in some form she couldn't predict. Will you make the statement? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. She pulled out her phone. What? Holt had a secure encrypted line to Ibarra's office operational by 4 a.m. Mara relayed the call from Price's room, holding the phone while Price spoke in the flat, careful cadence of someone dictating formal testimony, walking through 3 years of the arrangement with Soren, naming dates and intermediaries, and specific acts of deliberate misdirection. Ibarra's team was recording. The filing was going directly into the protected review record, sealed and time-stamped before the morning bureaucratic machinery started running. Mara stood by the window and watched Delport not yet wake up, and she listened to Price dismantle the thing he'd spent 3 years building, and she felt something she wasn't ready to name yet. Then Darcy called on the secondary line. Something's happening, Darcy said. Greer's office accessed the field log for yesterday's park operation 20 minutes ago. The preliminary hold Holt filed only covers 48 hours, and it doesn't block the regional chief of staff. Who in Greer's office pulled it? His senior administrative assistant, technically legitimate access. But Mara, if they pulled the field log, they know the operation ran. They know a drive was recovered, and they'll be looking at the evidence processing chain to find out what was on it. How long before they can access the evidence log? Processing holds block access for 72 hours unless a senior agent files an emergency override. Greer doesn't have that authority directly, but his office can request it through the field director, and the field director is in Greer's chain. The request could go through in 2 to 4 hours before anyone at the IG level can formally intervene. She looked at the time, 4:17 a.m. The IG's protective review was still being formalized, still filling its record, still not at the stage where it could block an emergency access override from a field director. There was a gap, a 2 to 4 hour gap during which Greer could reach into the evidence chain, see what the drive contained, and begin whatever contingency he had prepared for exactly this situation. She thought about the organizational diagram on Weld's table, about Soren's name at the center of it, about a man who had been building leverage structures for 5 years, and who had, by Price's testimony, anticipated and prepared for multiple failure modes. If Greer saw the drive's contents, the first thing he would do was call Soren. And the first thing Soren would do was activate whatever redundancy existed to ensure that the documentation of his involvement didn't survive long enough to reach trial. She went back to Price. Weld's copy of the archive, how is it stored? Encrypted on a local device. He has a cloud backup. Both require a passphrase only he knows. If something happens to Weld in the next 4 hours, the backup has a dead man protocol. If he doesn't authenticate within a 6-hour window, it transmits automatically to a distribution list. Price looked at her. He's careful. Good. She thought for 3 seconds. Is there anyone else Soren has leverage over in Delport PD or the field office? Someone with operational access who could move against our position directly before the review is formalized? Price hesitated. There was a name Greer mentioned once. An officer. Someone with access to the Bureau's physical evidence storage in the courthouse annex. He rubbed his face. I never had the full picture. I was compartmentalized. She looked at the nursing lanyard around her neck and thought about the courthouse annex where the physical storage drive from Caldwell Riverside Park was currently in an evidence locker, where it would stay, protected, until someone with the right access decided to walk in and take it. She called Holt. The physical drive from the park. Where is it right now? Evidence Locker 7 at the courthouse annex. Bureau jurisdiction. Key card access. Holt's voice sharpened immediately. Why? Because Greer's office just pulled the field log and someone in that building has access. She was already moving toward the door. We need to move the drive into IG protective custody tonight, before the review window closes. I can have an IG courier at the annex in 45 minutes. 45 minutes might be long. A hard silence. Then, I'll call Ibarra directly. If she can issue an emergency evidence transfer authorization. Do it now, Mara said. She left Price's room at a controlled walk that took everything she had not to make faster, nodded at Tilda at the station without slowing, pressed the elevator button, and stood in the hallway with the particular internal quality of someone waiting for something they couldn't control. The elevator took 40 seconds. She counted them. She was on the ground floor, moving toward the exit, when she saw him. He was standing near the main entrance in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no badge visible. But she knew his posture. She knew the specific configuration of someone who was positioned at an exit point deliberately, who had arrived not as a visitor, but as a watcher. She'd worked long enough in environments where that distinction mattered to read it without thinking. He was one of two. She picked up the second one near the south exit as she moved through the lobby, closer to the parking structure access, positioned to cut off movement toward the street. She didn't break stride. She turned toward the information desk with the natural adjustment of someone who'd realized they needed to check something, and she pulled out her phone as she walked, keeping the motion relaxed. Darcy, she said quietly. There are 2 people watching exits at Prentice, civilian clothes. I don't recognize them, but the positioning is deliberate. Can you make it to your car? I'd have to go through one of them. Staff exit? Loading dock on the east side, but if they've done basic coverage, they'll have it. She reached the information desk, set her hand on the counter in the posture of someone consulting the desk attendant, and ran through the building in her head. She'd spent 2 years here. She knew its floor plan better than most of the people who worked in it. There's a pharmacy delivery access on the north side of the building, she said, connected to the sub-basement supply corridor. It exits onto the service road behind the facility. I'll have a car on the service road in 12 minutes. Can you hold? I can hold. She looked at the desk attendant, a young man who was trying to project helpfulness despite it being 4 a.m. Can you tell me where the pharmacy is? 3rd floor, he said. Thank you, she said, and walked to the elevator like someone who needed to pick up a prescription, which was exactly the kind of minor errand that a nurse with a 2-year employment history at this facility would not be questioned about at any hour. She got off on 2, took the internal stairwell to the basement, moved through the supply corridor, fluorescent lights, wheeled equipment carts, the particular acoustic flatness of underground passageways, and found the pharmacy delivery access on the north wall exactly where she remembered it. She pressed through the door into the cold of the pre-dawn service road, and 2 minutes later a gray sedan she didn't recognize pulled up, and Darcy said through her phone, "That's Ide. Get in." She got in. Well, Holt's emergency evidence transfer authorization came through at 5:32 a.m. By 5:47, an IG courier team had entered the courthouse annex with the authorization and formally transferred the physical storage drive into Deputy IG Ibarra's protective custody. The chain of custody documentation was filed into the sealed review record at 5:51. At 5:54 a.m., a request for emergency access override to the Bureau's evidence logs arrived at the field director's office from Deputy Chief of Staff Wallace Greer's administrative team. At 6:02 a.m., the field director signed the override. At 6:03 a.m., the override was processed and returned an access denied error because the evidence in question had been removed from Bureau jurisdiction 11 minutes earlier and transferred to IG protective custody, which operated under a separate legal framework that an FBI field director's override authority did not touch. Darcy pulled this timeline from the system access logs and read it to Mara from the front seat of Ide's car while Ide drove and the city began, incrementally, to wake up around them. "He tried," Mara said. "He tried," Darcy confirmed. "And now there's a logged record of a senior Bureau official attempting to access sealed evidence in an active IG review." Her voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone watching something extremely complicated finally begin to resolve into something legible. He just put his own access attempt into Ibarra's protected record. He didn't know the transfer had happened. He didn't know until 30 seconds after he'd already requested the override, and by then it was logged. Darcy paused. He's going to know something went wrong on his end, and when he tells Soren, Soren will try to move. Mara looked out the window at the morning city. He'll try to remove the archive, or the people who know about it. Which means Weld ID, she said, looking at the back of his head from the rear seat. How long to Marlow County? 50 minutes, he said. Take me there. She was already calling Holt to request a protective detail on the safe house when Darcy said, "Wait," in a voice that had a different quality than everything that had come before it. Not urgent, not alarmed, but the specific tone of someone looking at something they hadn't expected to see. "What?" Mara said. "I'm in the IG's access system, the parts I can see from my level. There's an incoming document in the protective review file. It was just submitted." A pause. "It's from inside the Vortex Collective." She sat forward. "What kind of document?" "A voluntary disclosure," Darcy said slowly, "filed by a legal representative on behalf of an unnamed collective member. It's a cooperation offer, in exchange for prosecutorial consideration." Another pause, and when Darcy continued, her voice had gone very flat. "They're offering testimony against Soren, full cooperation, all documentation." The car moved through the morning streets. "They've been watching this unfold all night," Mara said. "They burned Price to contain Soren. When that didn't work, when we got to Price anyway, and the IG review opened, they made a calculation." Darcy's voice was careful. "The collective doesn't go down to protect Soren, not when the alternative is cooperation. So they're offering to bury him themselves, with full documentation of the intelligence archive, the leverage material, proof of how it was used." A long pause. "Mara, if this cooperation is genuine, the case against Soren isn't circumstantial anymore. It's direct. Primary source, corroborated by 2 independent evidentiary streams." She thought about the organizational diagram. Soren's name at the center. The patient architecture of a man who had spent 5 years building structures designed to ensure that someone else always took the fall, who had never expected the structures to collapse inward. "He's going to run," she said. "If he knows the collective turned, he'll know the moment his lawyer does." She grabbed the door handle. "Ide, how fast can we do this?" 50 minutes, Ide said again, "is as fast as the road allows." She settled back and looked at the city sliding past the windows and did something she almost never permitted herself in the middle of an operation. She thought about how it would end. Not the operational resolution, the human end. The morning when Aldrich Soren understood that the archive he'd used to control people was gone, that the federal officials who'd been his protection were turning on each other in interview rooms, that the apparatus he'd spent half a decade constructing had been disassembled by a woman on a park bench whom a corrupt cop had tried to bully into leaving. She let herself think about it for exactly 30 seconds. Then Darcy said, "Mara," and the quality of her voice had changed again, back to tight and urgent, back to the register of things going wrong before they go right. "What?" Weld's dead man protocol just triggered. She sat up. "He had 6 hours?" "The 6 hours ran out 22 minutes ago. He said it last night. He didn't anticipate being out of contact this long." Darcy's voice was controlled but moving fast. "The backup transmitted to his distribution list 3 minutes ago. 14 addresses. Lawyers, journalists, 2 members of oversight committees. The full archive." The car was very quiet. "It's out," Mara said. "It's out," Darcy confirmed. "All of it. To 14 people who are going to start reading it with their morning coffee." She looked at the dashboard clock. 6:19 a.m. In approximately 90 minutes, the first journalist on Weld's distribution list. She didn't know who it was, but she knew there was one. There was always one. Was going to begin reading documentation about Aldrich Soren's private intelligence archive, about the federal officials he'd managed, about 5 years of deliberate corruption embedded in the Pacific Northwest law enforcement infrastructure. And Soren, wherever he was going to feel the moment it happened, the way you felt a door you'd locked from the inside being opened from the other side, and there was going to be exactly one thing he could think to do. He was going to look for the person responsible. He was going to look for the person who had pulled the thread. He was going to look for a woman who, 12 hours ago, had been sitting on a park bench eating half a turkey sandwich in worn blue scrubs, whom a uniformed officer had decided was nobody. And that officer, Marcus Rowe, currently in witness retention, his body camera footage already in Holt's possession, his personnel history already sitting in Mara's operational file alongside his transfer records, and his connection to Conrad Faber and Raymond Stolk and the entire unraveling chain, was going to have a very specific conversation with federal investigators, the kind of conversation that started with, "I was just doing my job," and ended somewhere entirely different. She looked at her hands. The stethoscope was still around her neck. She took it off, looped it carefully, and set it on the seat beside her. She didn't need it anymore. But she was aware, in the particular way she'd learned to be aware of things that mattered, that what came next was going to require everything she had left, and that somewhere in a comfortable office in Portland, a man named Aldrich Soren was reaching for his phone, and the number he was dialing belonged to someone Mara hadn't yet identified, and whatever that person was about to be asked to do had a target, and the target was her. ID's phone rang at 6:23 a.m. He answered it hands-free without taking his eyes off the road, and the voice that came through the car speakers was Weld's, alive, unhurt, and deeply apologetic. "I forgot about the protocol," Weld said. "I set it 14 hours ago, and I lost track of the window." Mara closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. The archive transmitted. "To all 14 addresses. Yes, I know." A pause that carried genuine distress. "I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to go out uncontrolled." "Is your location compromised?" "No, no one came here. I've been in the back room with the documentation and I lost track of time, which I understand is not acceptable given—" "Porter," she stopped him. "Are you safe right now?" "Yes." "Then stay there. Don't open the door for anyone until Ide is back with a federal protective detail." She looked at Ide. He nodded, already recalculating the route. "The archive going out uncontrolled changes the timeline, but it doesn't change the outcome. It may actually compress it in our favor." She said it because it was true, and because Weld sounded like a man who needed to hear something true right now. "Hold position." She ended the call and stared at the road ahead. The archive was already in 14 inboxes. Some of those 14 people were going to read it immediately because that was the kind of document that arrested attention from the first line. Some were going to forward it to colleagues before they'd finished reading it. A few were going to make phone calls. And somewhere in that chain of reaction, within the next hour or two, someone was going to call a reporter who already had context on the Vortex Collective, or a congressional staffer who'd been asking questions about Pacific Northwest law enforcement for months, or an attorney who had a client with a very specific interest in anything implicating Aldrich Soren. The archive was loose in the world. That fact was settled. The question now was whether Soren moved before the world caught up to him, and whether the person he was calling at this moment was capable of doing damage before the institutional machinery got fully into motion. She called Holt. "I need to know who Soren uses for personal security." His corporate filings list a private security contractor out of Portland, Meridian Executive Protection. Licensed, legitimate on the surface. 6 employees, 2 of whom have prior law enforcement backgrounds. Holt's voice was already moving through it. "I can have their principals identified in 30 minutes. I don't need the principals. I need to know if any of them have current active access to federal facilities or law enforcement systems." She thought about what Price had said. Someone with access to the physical evidence storage in the courthouse annex. Specifically, if any of them have a contact inside Delport PD who could make a problem disappear or redirect a federal protective request. A short silence. "Conrad Faber. Pull everything on Faber. Tonight's communications, his access logs, anything that moved in the last 8 hours." "I'm already on it," Holt said. "Mara, there's something you should know before you hear it another way." Her tone shifted into the specific register of someone delivering information they'd rather not. "About 20 minutes ago, Deputy Director Greer attempted to initiate an emergency briefing with the field director. He cited an active threat to Bureau operations. The field director's assistant flagged it to Ibarra's office because the briefing request referenced the same case number as the IG protective review. He's trying to assert jurisdiction. He's trying to insert himself into the chain before Ibarra's review reaches the stage where his own name appears in it." Holt paused. Ibarra denied the briefing. She issued a formal conflict of interest hold on Greer's access to any materials related to the review. He's been locked out of the case file as of 22 minutes ago. Mara absorbed that. How did he take it? According to the assistant who relayed the denial, not well. Holt let that sit for a moment. He's making calls. We don't have full intercept capability on his personal devices, but his office landline has been in continuous use since 6 a.m. He's pulling whatever thread he has left. Yes, which is why I've requested a protective detail on your position. A slight firmness entered Holt's voice. Mara, I need your location. She looked at Ide. He gave her the road they were on. She relayed it to Holt, and she heard the quiet, efficient motion on the other end of someone deploying resources. And she let herself feel, for approximately 4 seconds, the specific exhaustion of a person who had been running at maximum operational capacity for the past 18 hours with no food, 3 cups of coffee, and approximately 45 minutes of something that had not technically qualified as sleep. Then she put the exhaustion away and thought about Aldrich Soren. She thought about what kind of man spent 5 years building an architecture of leverage and compliance, about what kind of patience that required and what it said about the way he saw other people. He hadn't built this because he needed money. His legitimate business interests were substantial. He'd built it because control was its own motivation. The particular satisfaction of knowing that the people who were supposed to hold power over you were themselves held. That nothing could touch you because you had arranged the world so that the people capable of touching you were too compromised to try. She understood. In the clinical way she understood most things about people who had crossed significant moral lines, that it had probably felt very secure for a long time, that the architecture had probably felt permanent, that the first indication of its impermanence would not compute immediately, would be processed first as a containable problem, then as a series of containable problems, and then, when the containment kept failing, as something else entirely. She wondered what that felt like from the inside. She didn't dwell on it. The Federal Protective Detail reached Ide's car on Route 9 outside Marlow County at 7:11 a.m. 2 vehicles, 4 agents, a supervisor named Reston, who had clearly been pulled from bed and hadn't entirely completed the transition to wakefulness, but who was professional about it. Ide transferred to one of the federal vehicles and led them to the safe house, while Mara rode with Reston and briefed him on Weld's location and status, in the tight, linear way she'd learned to brief people who needed to act on information immediately, without context. Weld was where he'd said he was. He opened the door when I'd knocked, and he looked at the protective detail with the expression of someone who had been a long time alone with a dangerous secret and was only now beginning to believe it might be survivable. She gave him 30 seconds. Then she sat across from him at the folding table. "The voluntary disclosure from the collective," she said. "Do you know who filed it? There's one mid-level figure, a logistics coordinator named Brent Halvard, who made contact with Ide 6 months ago. He was looking for an exit. Weld set his hands on the table. He's been documenting everything internally for the past year. He's the one who arranged the courier drop at the park. He's the one who put Price's name on the drive. He engineered the whole thing. He needed someone to find it who had the operational standing to do something with it. He'd been watching your operation for months. He decided you were the right person. Weld looked at her with a directness that was less assessment than something closer to recognition. He was right. She didn't respond to that. She was thinking about Halvard, about a man who had spent a year inside a criminal organization documenting its crimes, and then constructed a precise multi-stage operation to deliver that documentation to the right hands without exposing himself. The logistics of it. The patience. Where's Halvard now? In federal protective custody, Holt said from the doorway. She'd arrived while Mara was talking, quiet in the way experienced agents were quiet, taking in a room before announcing herself. Ibarra's team picked him up at 6:45. He's been talking for 40 minutes. She looked at Mara. His testimony is significantly more detailed than the documentary record alone. He has dates, communications, physical meetings. He was in rooms with Soren on 6 separate occasions. That's direct witness testimony. That's a prosecution, Holt said. At 8:03 a.m., Deputy IG Sylvie Ibarra formally notified the Department of Justice of an emergency referral in the matter of a senior FBI official, Wallace Greer, Deputy Chief of Staff, for obstruction, conspiracy, and abuse of authority. The referral was accompanied by 340 pages of supporting documentation and a recorded formal statement from a Deputy Director of the FBI. At 8:31 a.m., DOJ issued a travel restriction on Aldrich Soren, flagging his passport and notifying Border Control. At 8:44 a.m., Soren's attorney called Ibarra's office to request a meeting. The request was declined pending the formal issuance of charges. At 8:52 a.m., a Delport PD internal affairs investigator arrived at Lieutenant Conrad Faber's home address with a notice of administrative suspension pending a conduct review. Faber answered the door in a bathrobe and said nothing for a long time, which the investigator noted in her report. Mara was in Ibarra's field office when most of this was happening. A temporary command space the IG's team had established in a building downtown, 4 floors of controlled activity, the sustained motion of an investigation moving from collection into prosecution. She had given her formal statement between 7:40 and 8:20, sitting across from 2 IG investigators who asked questions with the careful precision of people who understood they were building a record that would be examined for years. She told them everything in the order it had happened, without editorializing, without managing the shape of the narrative. The park. Price's name on the drive. The call from Ide. Prentice Medical Center. The parking structure on the harbor. Weld's safe house. She told them about the 2 watchers at Prentice's exits, and about the service corridor, and about the 45-second wait for the elevator on the 4th floor. She told them about Nolan Price's face when she'd walked into room 418, the particular quality of a man who had run out of pretending. She did not tell them it had been easy, because it had not been easy, and the record should be accurate. When she was done, one of the investigators, a woman in her 40s named Beller, who had the compact attentiveness of someone who had been doing this long enough to hear the difference between testimony and performance, looked at her notes and then looked up. "You went into that hospital without backup," Beller said, "in your nursing cover." "Yes." "That was outside protocol." "Yes," Mara said again. Beller looked at her for a moment. "It also produced the only live corroborating witness we have for the Greer-Soren connection." She made a note. "I'm noting that in the record." Mara nodded. She stepped out of the interview room into the hallway and stood there for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, and she let herself be tired. Not dramatically. She didn't slide down the wall or put her head in her hands. She just stood still for 30 seconds and let the accumulated weight of 26 hours sit in her body without doing anything about it. Then Darcy appeared at the end of the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had also been awake for 26 hours and had decided that the only reasonable response was caffeine and forward motion. She handed Mara a cup without saying anything. Mara took it. "Thank you." "The courier, the one from the park, he's cooperating," Darcy said. "How is a low-level collective asset. He knew he was making a drop, but he didn't know the content of what he was carrying. Halvard used him specifically because he had plausible deniability. She sipped from her own cup. He'll get a reduced charge, probably probation. And Rowe? Darcy's expression shifted. Not quite satisfaction, more the particular neutrality of someone describing justice without editorializing. His body camera footage is in Ibarra's record, the full interaction at the park. Every word he said to you, every demand, the physical contact. She paused. His transfer to the downtown district was arranged by Faber. His personnel record shows 2 prior excessive conduct complaints, both reviewed and closed by Faber's office. Neither was forwarded to IA as required. He was being used, Mara said. He didn't know the whole picture. No, but he chose how to behave. Darcy looked at her coffee. He's been suspended pending review. The conduct complaints are being reopened. Faber's office doesn't exist to close them anymore. Mara thought about Marcus Rowe on the park path. The particular configuration of arrogance and smallness. A man who had built his sense of authority on his ability to make people feel like they had no recourse. She thought about how that worked, how it perpetuated itself, how it depended entirely on the assumption that the person in front of you was what they appeared to be and nothing more. That the woman in the scrubs on the bench was tired and harmless and wouldn't push back. The assumption had been wrong. The assumption was always going to be wrong eventually, about somebody. The tragedy of men like Rowe that they never understood that until the eventual somebody was already standing in front of them, showing a badge. She didn't feel satisfaction about it. She felt something more complicated and less clean, something that acknowledged both what he'd done and what had been done to him, the way corrupt systems created corrupt agents, the way power without accountability produced men who believed the rules were for other people. She felt that complexity, and she didn't resolve it into something simpler, because the simpler version would have been dishonest. At 10:17 a.m., Aldrich Soren was taken into custody at his Portland residence by DOJ agents operating under the emergency travel restriction, and a warrant issued on the basis of Halvard's testimony and the archive documentation. Mara was not there. She heard about it from Holt in a text message that said simply, "Soren in custody, Portland, 10:17. She was sitting in a plastic chair in the IG's field office hallway drinking her second cup of coffee when the message arrived, and she read it, and she put her phone face down on her knee, and she sat with it for a while. She thought about 5 years, about the cases that had been quietly redirected, the investigations that had collapsed at carefully engineered moments, the agents who had worked in good faith inside a structure that was being managed against them, about the informants who had taken risks on the assumption that the people they were trusting were trustworthy, about the communities in Delport that had been living inside the shadow of a criminal network that $60 million of federal law enforcement resources had failed to dismantle, in part because the person responsible for those resources had been steering them away from the target. She thought about what it cost to build something like that. Not financially. The cost to the people inside it, Price, who had been brought in gradually through a sequence of small compromises until the compromises were too large to walk back from. Greer, who had been at it long enough that she suspected he'd stopped thinking of it as corruption and started thinking of it as a parallel system. The collective members who were now cooperating because the alternative was carrying the weight of Soren's protection into their own prosecutions. And she thought, as she always eventually thought, in the aftermath of operations that had asked something significant of her, about the cost to herself. 2 years. A nursing license she'd earned through genuine effort that she now wasn't sure what to do with. A studio apartment on Prescott Hill where a plant was probably dying right now because she'd forgotten to water it again. The specific texture of becoming someone else so completely that you lost track of the seams and what it took to find them again after. She didn't have clean answers for any of it. She wasn't sure she trusted clean answers anymore, professionally or otherwise. What she had was this. The archive was in 14 inboxes and counting. Soren was in custody. Greer would be formally charged before the day was out. Price had made his statement and was in protective custody pending his own prosecution, which would come with the full weight of his cooperation credit and the complexity of a man who had done wrong, and then, at significant personal risk, tried to correct it. The Vortex Collective's leadership was looking at a cooperation-incentivized prosecution that would take months and produce convictions that the previous 3 failed investigations hadn't been able to get within reach of. And Marcus Rowe had 2 prior misconduct complaints, and a body camera, and a personnel file that was going to be examined very carefully by people who were not Conrad Faber. None of it was clean, but it was real. It had actually happened. And the things she'd learned over 2 years of being Mara Voss, over 12 months of real nursing and 12 months of operational work in a park bench and a hospital corridor and a parking structure in the pre-dawn harbor cold, was that real? Was better than clean. Real lasted. Real produced consequences that couldn't be quietly revised away. Holt sat down beside her. They didn't speak for a moment. The hallway had the particular ambient noise of an active investigation, movement, low voices, the occasional phone, the sound of documents being handled, the working sounds of institutions that were today actually working. Ibarra wants to debrief you formally next week, Holt said, when you've had some sleep and a meal that isn't coffee. Okay? She also said, Holt paused, and the quality of the pause told Mara something was coming that she should pay attention to. She said that the way this was handled, the operational decisions, the evidence preservation, the contact with Weld and Price, it demonstrated a level of judgment she wants on record for the purposes of what happens next. Mara looked at her. There's going to be significant restructuring, Holt said. The Pacific Northwest Regional Office is going to need oversight that comes from outside its existing chain. Ibarra is building a small independent unit that reports directly to the IG's office, focused on internal accountability, long-term corruption cases, the kind of investigations that require someone who can work outside the visible institutional structure. She met Mara's eyes. She asked me to tell you that position would be yours if you want it. The hallway noise continued. Mara held her coffee cup with both hands. That's not a field operation, she said. No, it's more complicated than a field operation. Holt held her gaze. It's the kind of work that needs someone who understands what it looks like when the system is being used against itself. Someone who knows how to operate when the chain of command is the problem. A slight pause. Someone who spent 2 years as a nurse in a hospital she actually worked in because she understood that the cover only holds if it's real. Mara looked at the opposite wall. There was a bulletin board there with printed notices pinned to it, standard office administrative material, nothing operational. One of the notices had a corner that had come unstuck and was folding forward, a small, persistent, unresolved thing. She thought about the plant on the windowsill. She was going to have to water it when she got back, or accept that it was gone. She thought about the moment in Price's hospital room, the particular exhaustion on his face, the way he'd said her name, the fact that even at the end of 3 years of wrongdoing, he had tried to get information to her because he knew she was the right person to use it. People made terrible choices, and then sometimes, imperfectly and too late, they tried to correct the direction of the damage. She'd spent 2 years being frustrated by human imperfection, and she'd also spent 2 years depending on it. I'd want to bring Darcy, she said. That's already assumed, Holt said. And I'd want operational independence, not just nominal independence. If I'm accountable to Ibarra's office, I need to be able to follow a thread wherever it goes without checking whether it's convenient. That's what she's offering. Mara was quiet for a moment longer. Okay, she said. Well, she went back to the apartment on Prescott Hill at 2 p.m. The plant was not dead. It was aggressively not dead, had in fact developed a new leaf since she'd last paid attention to it, which struck her as both encouraging and slightly accusing. She watered it. She stood in the kitchen of the life she'd been living for 2 years and looked at the nursing textbooks on the shelf and the uniform on the back of the bathroom door and the half-finished box of cereal on the counter that she'd bought 3 weeks ago and kept meaning to finish. The apartment smelled like someone had been living there, which was accurate. She sat on the edge of the bed and she called her mother in Tacoma, who picked up on the second ring because she always picked up on the second ring, and said hello in the way that contained about 40 layers of things she'd been thinking about since the last call. I'm okay, Mara said, before anything else. You don't say that unless you've been not okay, her mother said. I've been not okay, Mara said. But I'm okay now. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, are you coming home? In a few weeks. I have some things to finish here. She looked at the textbooks. Mom, I'm going to stay in Delport for a while. I have a job. The nursing. She thought about how to answer that. Something like it, she said finally. Something where the work is real. At 4:30 p.m., Wallace Greer was formally charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and abuse of authority. The charges were filed in open court, which meant they were public within the hour. By evening, 3 news organizations had published stories based on the archive that had arrived in their inboxes that morning. The stories were careful, sourced, and specific. They named Soren. They described the intelligence archive and its function. They described the mechanism by which federal investigations had been systematically compromised over a 5-year period. They did not name Mara. By Ibarra's explicit instruction, her identity remained protected, not because what she'd done was something to hide, but because the work she was going to do next required that she remain capable of doing it. At 6:15 p.m., Aldrich Soren's attorney released a brief statement saying his client denied all allegations and would contest the charges vigorously. By 9 p.m., 3 of Soren's closest associates had called the DOJ's cooperation hotline. What? Mara read the evening news from the couch in her apartment, the plant on the windowsill visible from where she sat, her badge on the coffee table where she'd set it when she came in. Not hidden, not displayed, just present, the way real things were present, occupying space without performing it. She thought about what Price had said about Soren finding people at the right moment, when they felt undervalued, when good work hadn't been recognized. She understood the appeal of that, not because she'd ever been susceptible to it. She thought she understood her own weaknesses well enough to know that particular door didn't open for her, but because she understood the condition it targeted. The specific tiredness of doing difficult work inside a system that sometimes consumed it without acknowledgement. The way that tiredness could accumulate into something that made the wrong offer feel like justice. She'd spent 2 years being Mara Voss, a nurse who was tired and competent and showed up and did the work and went home. She'd spent 2 years understanding what it felt like to have the work be real and the recognition be absent. The cover had been a professional tool, but the experience inside it had been genuine, and it had given her something she hadn't expected, a very clear understanding of why people stayed in systems that undervalued them, and what it cost, and what it meant when someone finally looked at them and said, "I see what you're worth." She thought about the bench in Caldwell Riverside Park, the broken slat on the left, the way she'd memorized it out of habit, the way you memorized the particular shapes of places you spent time in. She would probably not sit on that bench again, but she would remember it with the specific accuracy she applied to the things that mattered, not as a symbol, not as a story with a clean meaning, but as a place where something complicated had happened and come out correctly. Marcus Rowe had looked at a woman on a bench and seen nobody. He had made that assessment quickly and confidently and without interest in being wrong, the way people made assessments when they'd stopped being curious about what they might be missing. He had been wrong in a way that would restructure the rest of his career and possibly his understanding of his own judgment, though she held no certainty about the latter. She didn't find satisfaction in his wrongness. She found something more useful, confirmation that the assessment itself was the problem, that the habit of looking at a person and deciding, from surface information, that they were less than they appeared. That habit had costs, and those costs were paid by everyone in range of it, including eventually the person who held the habit. Power used to diminish people had a particular fragility. It depended on the diminished person accepting the diminishment. The moment they didn't, the moment they held still and said on what grounds in a clear voice and made you find an answer, the architecture started to show its weaknesses. She had held still. In the park, in Prentice, in the parking structure at 11 p.m. with a phone in her hand, and a man she'd never met telling her things she'd spent 2 years not knowing. She had been frightened in the controlled way she permitted herself to be frightened, and she had held still anyway. That was the work. Not the badge, not the credentials, not the years of training or the operational architecture or the precise tradecraft of a well-constructed cover. Those were tools. The work was the holding still. The refusal to move in the direction someone else's arrogance was pointing you, the patience to let the truth take the time it required, the willingness to stand in a place that felt untenable because you could see, further than whoever was applying the pressure could see, what was on the other side. She'd learned that slowly, the way you learned most things that mattered, not in a single lesson, but through accumulated contact with the reality of it. Through the specific fatigue of doing it on days when it didn't feel heroic, which was most days. Through the understanding that no one who underestimated you was doing you a favor, but they were sometimes doing you a gift, the gift of their complacency, their certainty, their absolute confidence that you were less than you were. She turned off the news. She would go to Tacoma in 3 weeks. She would sit in her mother's kitchen and eat something her mother had made and be, briefly and completely, a person with no operational responsibilities and a parent who looked at her with uncomplicated love and made coffee that was too strong. She would water the plant before she left. She would come back to Delport. She would start the new position, the work that Ibarra had described, and that she had accepted because it was real and because it was hard and because someone needed to do it who understood from the inside what it looked like when the system was being used against itself. She would carry the 2 years with her, not as damage, not as triumph, but as information. The particular texture of knowing what it felt like to do good work and have it unseen. To sit in a park in worn scrubs with half a sandwich and be dismissed by a person who had never considered that dismissal might be the last mistake he made in that version of his life. She would carry the park bench. She would carry Porter Weld's face when the protective detail arrived. She would carry Nolan Price saying her name in a dim hospital room with the exhaustion of someone who had finally decided that one honest thing was worth the cost of everything that came with it. She would carry Darcy's voice on the phone at 4 a.m., "I'm still here," which had been, in its own way, the most important thing anyone had said to her in 26 hours. She picked up her badge from the coffee table. She held it for a moment without looking at it. Then she set it back down. She would pick it up tomorrow. Tonight it could just be an object on a table, and she could just be a person who was tired and had done what she set out to do, and was, for the first time in a very long time, not pretending to be anyone at all. Outside the window, Delport was doing what cities did in the evening, settling into itself, the day's noise softening into something more livable. The harbor lights would be starting. Someone in the building was cooking something that smelled like garlic and olive oil. The plant on the windowsill had a new leaf. She thought about the women and men who would come after her and work like this, who would sit in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong appearance for the wrong assumptions of the people around them, and who would hold still, and who would wait, and who would let the truth take the time it required. She thought about how many of them were already doing it right now, in parks and hospitals, in parking structures, in back rooms, in safe houses in rural counties, doing work that no one was watching, work that wouldn't be acknowledged until the moment it turned everything over. She wanted to tell them something. She turned it over for a while, looking for the honest version of it rather than the version that sounded right. What she arrived at was this: the people who dismissed you were not the measure of what you were worth. The people who looked at your surface and decided you were manageable, controllable, containable, they were operating with incomplete information, and that was their problem, not yours. Carry what you know. Do the work that's real. Hold still when everything in you wants to move in the direction someone else is pushing. The truth doesn't need you to be loud. It needs you to be patient and present and unwilling to leave before it arrives. She'd sat on a bench in a park for 6 days in a row and waited for the right moment. The moment had come. Everything else had followed. She stretched out on the couch, and she closed her eyes, and she was asleep within 3 minutes. Not peacefully, because she was too tired for peaceful to be a meaningful category, but deeply and completely, in the way of someone who has earned it through the full weight of what it cost. The badge sat on the coffee table. The plant held its new leaf. The city kept going, the way cities did, carrying its 10,000 stories inside it, most of them quiet, most of them unseen, most of them belonging to people who would never be mistaken for nobody again.